Michael Swanson is the founder and editor of the financial website wallstreetwindow.com, where he writes about the financial markets. Before founding that site, he co-managed a hedge fund from 2003 to 2006. Swanson has a master's degree in American history from the University of Virginia and has written works of 20th century American history, including Danville, Virginia, and the Coming to the Modern South, and one of the greatest books you'll ever read, The War State, The Cold War Origins of the Military-Industrial Complex and the Power Elite. He is currently working on a book covering the beginning of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War from 1945 to 1963. And I'll tell you just a little personal anecdote. You know, we get a lot of books at the Future of Freedom Foundation that people send us to look at and review and so forth. And so when I got The War State from Mike Swanson, I didn't know who he was. And so I thought, well, it's just another one of those books. And I start to stumble through it, and I was just stunned. And I start really looking through it, and I take it home that night, and I was just overwhelmed with what the power of this book. And so I contacted him, and we later met at a conference in Pennsylvania on the JFK assassination, and we've become good friends. And I can't recommend this book too highly. And in fact, he donated several copies, so most of you have this book in your packets, and that's compliments of Mike Swanson. The title of Mike's talk is, What is the Purpose of the National Security State? Michael Swanson.
Well, thanks for that kind introduction, Jacob, and it's a great day to be here for everybody. And we all have read many of the same books and studied each other's books and works, and even talked on the internet at times on Facebook, or watched each other's YouTube shows for that matter. I was thinking about that walking up here because just 2 weeks ago I watched Ron Paul do an interview with Nassim Taleb, and it's real relevant for this topic because in that interview they talked about the national security state and the decisions to intervene in other countries, and why the people who make these decisions never seem to disappear or get fired or anything. And Taleb's answer in this interview is because they have no skin in the game, and that's one answer. I'm going to try to provide an additional answer to it, but that's not to say I disagree with everything Taleb says. He's someone I actually have been influenced a lot by. But a lot of studying a topic like this, I think, is about asking the right questions and going from deeper questions as time goes on. So the question that's kind of, when I wrote the book you have in your hands, I was focusing on the idea that the United States had become an empire, basically, after World War II. And if we flip to this statement right here, this is David Petraeus, February the 1st at the Armed Services Committee. Essentially, he's not saying the word empire, but he's sort of stating that we have an international order that we seek to maintain, and if we stop doing so, he states, it'll collapse, and obviously there will be, he implies bad consequences to that. Now, so that's his answer. And what I want to do is go through, in this presentation, one of the things I'm going to do is show what people such as Petraeus in the past has said the purposes of the national security state is. But the question that's actually kind of gripped me over the past couple of years is, how does this thing actually work? How are the decisions in it actually made? And I don't think it's simply people don't, they can make mistakes and they're not punished. But there is a repeating pattern of the type of decisions that seem to result. And the last presentation you heard with Doug Horn, he spoke about Operation Northwoods. And you hear something like that, and other, you can think of other events that we don't know all the circumstances of, or events that we do, and wonder what the heck is going on? What are these people thinking? And I'm going to try to give them their argument in this presentation. And one of the things, when you research stuff, you'll dig something up and you'll say, what in the world is this? And, and this has a name to it. It's just like, this is like out of Dr. Strangelove or something. So there's something called Project Control. It was a study done by the Air Force in the time period 1953-1954. And I'm going to use this as a case study and come back to it at the end of the presentation. But what this was at the U.S. Air War College, there was a colonel, Raymond Sleeper, who was taking classes, getting his doctorate, and he did a dissertation on air power and how to win the next war that the Air Force might fight. And he looked back at World War II, World War I, and so forth, and he wanted to make the next war one that the Air Force would win for sure. And he came up with this idea of Project Control. And what it was to go to the Soviet Union, and at the time they had a huge disadvantage in nuclear weapons in regards to the United States. They didn't have any nuclear missiles that could reach the continental U.S. They only had a handful of bombers that would have had to refuel to make it back. It's dubious if they would have been able to drop anything. So we had a huge advantage in the 50s and to continue to the mid-60s, really. And his plan was, okay, we'll go to the Soviets. We want them to surrender. This is a plan to win. So we will do intensive overflights over the Soviet Union at first to kind of intimidate them and scare them. And then we'll drop a couple bombs. And then we'll issue them an ultimatum and tell them, you better surrender now. And then if they don't, we'll stop dropping atomic bombs until they do. Sort of heightened up version of what happened to the Japanese after World War II. Now, what was interesting about this study is it went up to, this is a guy just doing a dissertation, and it goes up to the top levels of the Air Force, and they hear about it, and they get all excited, and they say, oh, this is not just a dissertation. We're going to devote huge resources at the U.S. Air War College to make this a workable plan. They even got people in the CIA to work on it, people from outside the Air Force, so even civilians, about 100 people. They spent a year working on it. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff told them he liked the idea. And he briefed Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of Defense, Wilson, and it was mentioned in two National Security Council meetings. You can read them in the Foreign Relations of the United States series. They don't use the word Project Control in the minutes, but in the two latter meetings I have listed right there, it's discussed. What should we do? The two topics are, what should we do about the Soviet Union at this point in time going forward? It's President Eisenhower with his top national security advisors and Joint Chiefs of Staff and so forth, the chairman. And they debate, should we just bomb them? Should we do a first strike in the guise of this Project Control? And interesting enough, John Foster Dulles argues no. And I find that interesting because, in the public imagination, he's the one associated with rollback, nuclear retaliation, and so forth. And he says, no, this is a bad idea. And his reasoning is that he says this would be strategically pointless, that we wouldn't really win anything out of this. And then he talks about Eastern Europe, and he says, we really don't even need to roll back in Eastern Europe, which is amazing because this is the guy that, in public is saying this all the time. And his argument is that, well, if Eastern Europe, if we roll them back, we're not really going to get anything because the Soviets are still going to be there. And in 5-8 years, they'll have nuclear weapons. And so there's really nothing to gain. We'll just keep Western Europe. So there was a point of this is over a month period inside the Air Force. And I'm not saying the entire Pentagon was on board with this or the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff. But inside the Defense Department and the Air Force, there was a move to get a program like this trickled up. And it got, briefed to the people at the highest levels, and it gets rejected. And Eisenhower, I think, at that, nothing like this ever comes up again, as far as I know. from looking at these documents. Now, all this sounds wacko. I mean, really. I mean, it's so crazy. John Foster Dulles rejected it. So, but in reality, you know, what I'm trying to figure out, and I'm going to show you my answers here, is how do arguments like this make sense to these people? How does something like Operation Northwoods or this Project Control, you know, make sense to people in the national security state, or at least some of them? Now, again, that's the book I wrote, and I just want to emphasize that to go back to the David Petraeus statement, you know, what I touch about in the book is really the creation of the American national security state after World War II up to the end of the Kennedy presidency, and it didn't exist before World War II, and now we take it for granted. It's an everyday part of our lives. It's, you know, the question on TV is going to be soon, should Donald Trump, our president, send troops to Afghanistan? So it's always, you know, about where should we intervene next, basically. And if you go back, though, to the Petraeus statement, if you just look at the simple logic of it, he seems to suggest that if we don't maintain order throughout the world, then everything will collapse. So that would imply that intervention or some sort of aggressive foreign policy is necessary. And I think that's the real purpose of the national security state. Now, there's other purposes to defend us, let's say, against China. I don't know what the odds of them attacking us tomorrow are, or defending us against terrorism, which has got a slightly higher odds, but on an individual basis, it's not very likely. And then you have to wonder, what are the costs of intervention? Is this just a, you know, does the interventions themselves create the terrorism that, you know, we hear about now almost every week somewhere in the world? So I would assert that fighting terrorists or stopping terrorists is an objective of the national security state, but it's not the primary objective. The primary objective being basically to maintain its view of international order, or I would say world order. But I think that, you know, a result of that is you end up creating essentially endless wars. The funny thing, though, is you study these topics, and if you look at something like CIA regime changes in the 1950s in Guatemala and Central America and Iran and elsewhere, you can conclude, well, what's the purpose of the national, if you ask yourself, what's the purpose of the national security state? If you look at those operations, you might say, well, it's to protect United Fruit Company, it's to protect the oil interests in Iran, it's maybe to protect the clients of the Dulles brothers who were running the CIA at the time. And if you go to the Vietnam War and you read about Laos and Cambodia, you can find books about drug smuggling of heroin out of those countries. There was drug smuggling in the United States during the Nicaraguan War, the Contra covert operations. And you might think, well, it's all about drug smuggling. People are making money from drugs, and maybe there's a whole deep state involved in doing that. Or is it about just simply the purpose really about the defense industry and making profits for General Dynamics and Raytheon that are just up the road here, and getting them to give campaign contributions to congressmen to give them more contracts and so forth? These are, I think, side effects of different historical periods of, you call them war operations, covert operations, national security state operations, but I can't find any evidence, though, that any of those things motivates the people I'm looking at, primarily in the Pentagon, that are making decisions or making proposals, that I don't think they care, those people, about any of those things. And I think those are really the people at the top of the national security state, the most important people running it. But it's become so much a part of our life. If you look at this conference that we're at now, we're in the Fairfax, Virginia area, and it's kind of ironic because the CIA headquarters is in Fairfax County, the National Counterterrorism Center is in Fairfax County, Fort Belvoir is in Fairfax County, which is the headquarters for Army Intelligence, which is actually larger than the Central Intelligence Operation. Now, in the history of this county is tied up with the national security state and the American economy. In 1950, there were 100,000 people living in this county. In 1955, 65,000 people were employed here. 31,000 of them worked for the federal government, 11,000 for the Central Intelligence Agency. In the 1950s, there was a complete boom in the defense industry and really the national security state, tied in with an arms race, which was really non-existent, with the Soviet Union, which I'll talk about in a minute. But during that boom, the population of this county tripled. And then in the 1960s, under the Vietnam War, it doubled again. So the health of this county, or the economy of it's directly tied into the national security state and interventions overseas. Now, the funny thing about that is if you look at average income per person in the United States, rank it by counties, this county is number 2 in the entire country. Number 1 is Loudoun County, which is a neighboring county to this one. I guess that's where all the bosses work at. But for the rest of the country, there are, in the world for that matter, there's cost to all this. I would say the history that we're studying, or most of us in here are very interested in regards to the Kennedy era, is a direct consequence of the rise of the national security state. And I would say, to just put it real simple, political instability of the 1960s and 70s, whether you want to look at political assassinations or simple riots in the streets, anti-war marches, whatever you want to look at, it's political instability. And then the debts during that war piled up. In 1967, they got to be so large that there was a crisis. 1967 was really a crisis year for the national security state that really hasn't been studied in that way. Hopefully someone will pick up that project. But what happened was it became clear in the summer of 1967 that they weren't winning the Vietnam War, and at the same time riots in the ghettos across America were breaking out, and at the same time gold was fleeing the vaults of the United States and flowing into Europe. And there's a quote where the head of Army Intelligence is writing to a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and saying the American empire is in crisis because of these 3 things I just listed. So the people running this knew, this was kind of cracking up. And, and then we had Watergate, the Church Committee hearings, the House Select Committee of Assassinations, attempts to reform, some successful probably, some not, but they were there. But today, then we had the Reagan era, and he ran for president on making America great again and turning the page on these times of troubles. And for much of the country, I think he did succeed at that. The economy boomed, the stock market boomed, and so forth. But now here we are today, after 9/11, after more endless wars, seeming return to some strange fashion of political instability, where we have the media on TV comparing Donald Trump to Richard Nixon and so forth, and just crazy times. And everyone, I think, no matter what side of the political spectrum you are on, everyone feels like that on all sides of it. But probably nobody, if I could recommend one book about this topic, I'd recommend David Stockman's book, The Great Deformation, on the topic of the costs of all this. Now I'll return to statements of some of these national security officials on the purposes of the national security state. This is from the Pentagon Papers, written in 1967, again, that year of crisis. And Robert McNamara commissioned them to go and look, what are the reasons we got in this war? And he came back, he got this answer back from the guy that was in charge of the papers. 70% of the reason was to simply avoid defeat, and only not to help a friend, that wasn't on the list. 10% to help South Vietnamese determination, in other words, to help that government survive. 20% to keep South Vietnam out of the hands of China. Well, what the statement shows is that, to me, is that the reasons for continuing the war were simply to continue the war. But that might, I'm not, but why? Why is it necessary to simply continue this? And I would say, skipping ahead a little bit, but I would say that they have a fear, and I'll show you the quotes on that in a second, but there's a fear that if any element of the national security state were to pull back from a war or a confrontation, or even pull bases back, that's a sign of what they call provocative weakness. And that's a statement you can find in national security speeches and documents. I've got a quote I'll show you in a second of Donald Rumsfeld saying this at his retirement speech. And with John F. Kennedy, that's essentially what he was doing. He was pulling back from confrontation with the Soviet Union in the last year of his life, and his famous peace speech and so forth. And from the Vietnam War, and even trying to limit the defense budget. But he explicitly, in his peace speech, said, we don't want a Pax Americana, which is a complete repudiation of basically saying we're going to maintain order around the world through the use of nuclear power and our weapons. But to think about the Vietnam War, though, for Kennedy himself, he sent advisors there in 1961, and it was primarily in his goal. You could describe it as a nation-building project to help the South Vietnamese defeat an insurgency and develop their nation. He was skeptical of whether it would succeed, but that was the mission he sent people to do. And the idea was you're going to have about 15,000 advisors over there, and these are trainers. They're going to stay by the end of his term. He put in writing they're staying till 1965, and that's going to be their mission. But for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who really pushed Kennedy to intervene in Vietnam in the first place, they didn't see Vietnam as a nation-building project at all. They saw it as primarily competition with China, that China was the dominant power in Asia, and they were going to grow and influence into Southeast Asia in their view. And it was going to be between the U.S. and China who's going to be the big bad player in Southeast Asia, and they were determined it would be us. And this shows up first, this type of thinking, actually in this August 1954 meeting of Dwight Eisenhower, there's a discussion about China after Dien Bien Phu fell, which was the French effort there. And they were talking, what do we do now with China and in Vietnam? And the same proposals came up. One question was, well, should we just bomb them? They said, no, we're not. Eisenhower, no, we're not going to do that. And they basically settled on the idea, we will give them threats. We will tell them if they go into another country, we will bomb them. But we will develop and defend South Vietnam and Southeast Asia. So that was the initial genesis of U.S. direct involvement in South Vietnam. And Eisenhower sends a very small handful of people over there. The CIA, of course, helps Diem, who's the South Vietnamese premier, get a foothold in power and maintain it. And the whole effort ends up collapsing by the end of Kennedy's era, at least Diem's rule, and it becomes a militarized operation completely by the time Lyndon Johnson is in there. But the point is that China was the big thing, and in their view, the Joint Chiefs of Staff view wasn't, we're going to go develop this country. It was, okay, who's going to rule the world, really, in this part of the world, the U.S. or China? And Vietnam, that's what Vietnam was about for them. And in fact, Robert McNamara himself wrote a letter to LBJ basically saying this is the reason we got involved here in the first place, this China issue. And his national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, in early 1965, wrote a famous memo telling LBJ he needed to intervene in South Vietnam more aggressively and bomb. And he had China also as the main reason. And he said in this memo that he didn't think we had a better than 50% chance of even winning. But it would still be worth doing to show China how serious we were about using military force. So if we look at really the founding document, I think, of the Cold War, it's NSC 68, written in 1950. It was a lobby effort, really, by the Secretary of Defense and Truman, or Secretary of State, and Truman was uneasy about even signing it because what they were aiming to do and what they did with this document was justify the huge arms race of the 1950s. And that line in the document, though, at the end shows me that it's more than about Cold War, communism. It's, again, about maintaining order around the world. And in this document, they weren't looking to, they were looking to contain the Soviet Union and China and communism, not looking to do first strikes or even rollback. But this key line, though, justified treating every other country in the so-called third world, any neutral country, as an enemy if they're not an ally. So a buzzword used today is full spectrum dominance. You see that in Pentagon Papers. There was a Pentagon paper written after 9/11, which was a document similar to NSC 68, like a strategic overview. This is what we're doing. And it's called, I think, Vision 2020. And it was the first document to use this line, full spectrum dominance, in it. And this is the definition of that, according to the Department of Defense. And a dictionary I found just an entry just a couple weeks ago. But to make a long story short, what they assert is they want total control, basically, of any potential battlefield on the planet, including your cell phone, for that matter, and the computer. So, and now we have information wars. If there's anything going to come out of the controversy of Russia and Trump and what did Trump do, one side effect of this is going to be an intensive focused by the Pentagon on information wars, which really hasn't been there at all. I was watching a hearing about the CIA report that came out, whether the CIA, whether Russia intervened in the election or not, and the whole hearing was mostly about we need more money to start doing this ourselves, and build a base in NATO to do this in Central Europe. So that was really an interesting thing. Now, another key phrase, which I used earlier, is provocative weakness, which really I think applies to the Kennedy era and what some members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff had seen as a problem with Kennedy, and that's that any weakness could be interpreted as provocative by any potential enemy and therefore risks us, our own security. So that's a that's a mindset that can justify a lot of things, But what they really meant, if you go to the Kennedy era, is that even though the U.S. had this huge advantage at the time in nuclear arsenal compared to the Soviets, and the Chinese actually had nothing while Kennedy was president, they worried that if the Soviets didn't believe we would use them, then the weapons actually were fairly meaningless. In a certain sense, that's probably true. But I mean, what's the answer to that? It's just the way the world is. What are you going to do? Just use these weapons? And the problem is, if you take these type of thinking to their logical conclusion, you're going to get dangerous situations in crises, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the demands among the Joint Chiefs of Staff for Kennedy to bomb Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, proposals such as the Operation Northwoods, reflects a desire to have a more aggressive posture, take advantage of opportunities when you can get them. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, some members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff actually saw Kennedy's blockade or hesitation to make a decision, in their view, as provocative weakness. And they actually wrote memos to Robert McNamara lecturing him not to flinch if war turned out to be necessary, saying that they could even win. And here's one such memo. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the ending sums it up. This is no time to run scared. So, this is during the depths of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And a fascinating moment in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I think provides light on all this. What I'm really trying to do is get into what are the motivations of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And there's the famous confrontation is when Kennedy is meeting the Joint Chiefs of Staff in person. He gets into an argument of Curtis LeMay. Doug Horn mentioned that at the end of his talk. But the next day after that meeting, there is a very fascinating final meeting, not the end of the crisis, but a decision meeting, in which Kennedy and the members of the group talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis with him make the final decision on whether to do a blockade or whether to do an airstrike. They've been arguing about this, and now they have a final argument. And unfortunately, this is one meeting we don't have tapes of, and we don't have word-by-word transcripts of the meeting, but we have notes. And the most fascinating, they do decide to do the blockade, obviously, but one of the most fascinating parts of this whole discussion is this line from the notes, where General Taylor explains why they need to bomb Cuba. And he says, namely, if we do not destroy the missiles and the bombs, we will have to change our entire military way of dealing with external threats. What does that mean? Well, I mean, I'm not trying to say Taylor's crazy. I'm trying to say, at some point you do kind of have to laugh at these things because it is like dark stuff. You talk about Project Control and talk about nuking the Soviet Union, basically. And then here's a really strange line, but I think you can understand how someone could think or say something like this. Then I think we can understand how the national security state works, or at least how the Joint Chiefs of Staff works in the Pentagon, and what the real purpose is. Now, President Eisenhower's fear about what he called the military-industrial complex, in that famous speech, I got it on the cover of my book, his fear wasn't that the next president would be hemmed in by the national security state, so to speak, or that we're going to have the Vietnam War or anything like that. What he primarily was scared of was our form of government actually changing completely, or our way of life. And in a series of a couple National Security Council meetings, his final ones, he expressed what this fear was, that the spending that the military was going to demand was going to overwhelm the government budget and just completely bust it. And he thought the result of that would be inflation that would get out of control. And I've always thought to myself, over the years, that, well, we have a giant budget deficit, and maybe everything's just going to go broke, and that'll be how our empire ends. We just go broke. And I think that seems sort of logical, but that's not what Eisenhower thought would happen. He thought what would happen was the inflation would get out of control, and it would never end. And that would basically mean the end of private enterprise as we know it, and everything would just be consumed by this. I mean, it's hard to imagine this kind of scenario. I mean, I can't really imagine it. And it obviously didn't happen. But then again, it did happen, because in 1972, the United States went off the gold standard. Um, when we were on the gold standard, there was an actual limit to the size of the budgets we could make. And as I mentioned earlier, around 1967, the flow of gold started to go out of the United States into Europe because these deficits got bigger. And no one really knew what was going to happen. You can go back to the 1970s and find books predicting this would mean the complete collapse of Western civilization, basically, the end of the gold standard. And luckily, Nixon took us off, and one result was there was inflation in the 1970s. Not as bad as Eisenhower feared, but it did happen. And then the situation seems to have settled down eventually with Ronald Reagan and Paul Volcker with lots of costs. Raising interest rates to stop inflation wiped out farmers across the whole country, put lots of people out of work. So there's victims to these economic policies that were necessary as a result of the whole mess of the Vietnam War financially, and basically the fears Eisenhower actually had coming to root in a way you don't really think of unless you read those notes and hear him talk about how he's worried about government spending. Now, I like to recommend one book to read about the subject of bureaucracy, because in the end, that's what the national security state is. It's a bureaucratic institution, and that's the best way, I think, to understand it. And a bureaucracy operates differently than a private enterprise does, and that sort of links back to the Nicholas Taleb saying that he had that these people have no skin in the game. In a way, they have no financial loss at stake if they make a decision to, send people to war. But I think there's more to it than that, and it has to do with the way decisions inside of a bureaucracy are made, which isn't an easy thing to understand, even if you are in one. But I think that's how General Taylor can speak about, we've got to use these weapons or bomb, or else the weapons are no good, and then I have no purpose anymore. Basically, is what he's saying. What are we going to do? But the Mises book doesn't. It's a short book. It's pretty easy to read, and he's not saying all bureaucracies are bad. If I recall right, he likes the police force and the postal service. But either way, if you just look at the postal service or think of the Ponytail Express, that's a small bureaucracy. It's not that big. And they have a very simple, defined mission. That's just deliver the mail, and that's it, and go home at night and take our paycheck. With the national security state, they don't have a simple mission. Their mission expands, it expands, and expands with two purposes: to keep the United States safe, or us safe, but also to maintain order all over the world, which I think is their primary mission. But I wonder, to them, that makes perfect sense and is completely, in their mind, necessary. But I wonder if it really is. And a way a bureaucracy works, of the size of the Pentagon, most of the decisions are made at a lower level by people that are trying to do what they think their superiors want them to do, basically. Create proposals that they think will get passed or accepted, not make proposals that will be rejected. And they can take on, basically, in their own mind, the objectives of the organization. And any organization or bureaucracy, such as a national security state, it comes into being with a purpose, a good purpose, at first. It came into being to win World War II, essentially. And I think it's, by the time we're bombed at Pearl Harbor, I think it's hard to argue against that. But any bureaucratic organization this big, over time, it'll come to have its own purposes that go beyond the original purpose. And that's one of the key insights of this book here, and also this book. probably the best. I mean, if you forget about reading my book or the other Beast's book, but read this one. If you're going to read one book, Militarism USA, it's written by James Donovan, forward by David Shoup. David Shoup was commander of the Marine Corps under John F. Kennedy. He was on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. James Donovan was one of his assistants. What this book does is essentially make all the arguments I just made today in a more eloquent manner and by someone who was there, you know, at the highest levels. He won the Medal of Honor. You can't really argue with his life experience. Now, one thing he shows in that book, though, is he breaks down how the decisions on the Joint Chiefs of Staff are made. And they're made the way he depicts it on the planning staff, which Horn mentioned. But the planning staff consists of about 400 individuals from all branches of the service, mostly colonels, and their whole job is to come together and create war plans to figure out how we're going to fight this war or that war. And one thing they have to do is incorporate every branch of the service into the plans, because they have to please everybody that they're working for. You know, they're coming from their own organizations, and they got to divide up the budgets to make sure everyone's got a role, and so forth. So I'll go back to that project control as a case study of bureaucracy. So here's this fella, writes a dissertation. It goes up to the highest levels of the Air Force, and it's kooky, you know, basically. Nowadays, we think of it as silly. And it was rejected by the White House and and Eisenhower's advisors. But why now did this go up? Well, I was reading about this in the Air Force history of this project, and after the French were defeated in South Vietnam, the Air Force had a problem, which I've read this for the first time. This is amazing. So when Eisenhower was president, he actually gave the Air Force more money than he did the other branches of service, and with a new look policy. But what it said was, you're going to use these weapons as a first strike. Not as a first strike, as a massive retaliation in case they do something to us. And that actually left the Air Force out of plans on what to do in the next war in Vietnam or elsewhere with atomic weapons or anything else. So how are we going to win a guerrilla war in South Vietnam or Laos or any of these other countries? What's the role of air power? And this guy's dissertation solved that. The next war will be not World War II and a half, not a guerrilla war. It'll be World War III, and they loved it because of that reason. So, at the time. So thanks for being here and being a part of this conference.